nor do the rituals earn the blessings the way they did for other gods. As with the temple, his cultic instruments, his priests, his kings, Yahweh was more than happy to dispose of any of these things as soon as they became means of controlling him and barriers to worship of others. Saul found this out the hard way when he tried to use his spoils of war as a way of bribing Yahweh when he didn't follow God's orders to the letter. As Yahweh would point out in Psalms, sacrifices do not do anything for him. He doesn't need them. In fact, he says through Isaiah and Amos, he grows to hate these rituals, festivals, and songs that he had actually originally prescribed. While the Judahites faithfully fulfilled the technical prescriptions of the Torah, they utterly neglected the moral prescriptions of justice, mercy, and humility.
Drama has followed the Ten Commandments since the beginning. God himself spoke from the top of Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning. The commandments are the only part of Scripture that God himself physically wrote. Down through the ages, the commandments have been the benchmark of morality in Judeo-Christian thought, and today, the displaying of the commandments continues to be a source of controversy and drama. But what are the commandments? These 10 rules important enough for God to personally deliver. Join us on this 12-part journey through the commandments that form the bedrock for what following Christ looks like.
At the end of The Lion and Witch in the Wardrobe, while the Pevensey children are celebrating their victory and coronation, Aslan, the great lion, quietly slips away. When the new kings and queens notice this, Mr. Beaver tells them he'll be coming and going. One day you'll see him, and one day you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. It's quite all right, though. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. He's not a tame lion. Not a tame lion. Aslan wasn't someone that was at the beck and call of the Pevensey children, or anyone else in Narnia, or anywhere else in that world for that matter. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, where he wanted, and how he wanted. The Narnians served Aslan, not the other way around. Most importantly, he was totally beyond their control, something that they must accept and trust, that while wild, he would be good at. In this scene, C.S. Lewis captures the heart of the second commandment, which is what we're going to talk about in this episode. It's often mixed up with the first commandment, and these two are misunderstood in modern attempts to translate a very culturally specific concept, namely idolatry, into a modern world where the ancient practice of idolatry doesn't really exist anymore, at least not the way it did back then. To begin with, it is best to read the commandment itself, which is found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. And there's a nearly identical version in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. I'll be reading my own translation of this passage, but feel free to follow along in any other translation. You will not make for yourselves idols or any image which is in heaven above, which is on the earth below, or which is in the sea or under the earth. You will not prostrate or worship to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a zealous God, visiting the rebellion of the fathers upon the sons, upon the grandsons, upon the great-grandsons, to those who hate me, but doing kindness, or chesed, to the thousands who love me and keep my commandments. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, of course, and we could do a whole series just on the different facets of this commandment, from understanding ancient idolatry in a modern context to the question of the image of God or the Imago Dei, to what is going on with this idea of punishing to the third and fourth generation. To try and tackle all of these concepts in a single half-hour episode would fail to do any of them justice. So instead, we're going to focus specifically on what idolatry is or was, and why Yahweh was so vehemently opposed to that. Not only does he prohibit the use of idols in the second commandment, but he adds a rather severe warning to anyone who dares do so that you don't find in really any of the others. Admittedly, the second commandment does feel like a rehashing of the first. At least in my experience, we tend to treat idols and gods as synonyms, with preachers often asking us to identify the idols in our lives that are coming between us and God. For some reason, TV, smartphones are popular choices. What is often meant by these being the gods in our lives, which isn't even an accurate interpretation of the first commandment and has nothing to do with the second. We often talk about gods and idols as if they are the same thing, treating two separate commandments and separate concepts, for that matter, as one. But these are not the same thing. The text and subsequent interpreters down through the ages have treated them as two separate and distinct commandments. But this raises the question that we must answer if we are going to understand this commandment. First, what is an idol? How is it distinct from a god? How is it different from any other form of artwork? If I take a picture of someone, is that an idol? It is a representation of something on the earth below. Why does Yahweh care so much about us making idols? What if it's an image of him? Why is it that a problem? I am still, in theory, worshiping Yahweh after all. To answer all of these, let's dive in. Let's begin with the first question. What is an idol? Much like polytheism, as we discussed in the previous episode, idols are a totally foreign concept to those of us having grown up in a professed monotheistic, if not atheistic, worldviews, such as in the West, like the United States. Now, there are some who are listening who might have come from Roman Catholic traditions or even Eastern Orthodox, and you may have a better grasp of the concept of idols, at least as it compares to icons. But for most of us, when we think of idols, we usually think of a statue with a bunch of half-naked people dancing around it. Now, admittedly, this image isn't entirely inaccurate, as the golden calf episode of Exodus chapter 32 demonstrates. At times, half-naked dancing was definitely involved with idols. However, an idol wasn't merely a visual representation of something. What idols could be, or why idols could be, in many cases were works of art. Not all art, even art of a deity, was an idol. Not every statue of a god was an idol. In fact, very few statues were. Only a few. Indeed, if you had two identical statues made side by side, made by the same artist, one might be an idol, and the other might simply be a nice piece of lawn art. So what's the difference between the two? An idol was a physical representation of the deity that housed the essence of a deity. Making an idol was creating a physical form for the god to inhabit for the purpose of interacting with people. And by people, I mean priests and kings and a handful of other rich, wealthy people. Commoners and plebs like you and I wouldn't interact with these gods. Now, that didn't make the idol the god itself, but at the same time, it wasn't not the god either. More like the god was present in the statue. This is why the first and second commandment are distinct from each other. To get from a statue an idol was a bit of a process. Not every image, or even most images, as I said, house the deity's presence, or even could. After all, no god wants to live in just any old statue. So to provide a place for the god to inhabit, you had to first make the best possible image of said god that you could. The very crafting of an idol was an intense process, and choices had to be made that were literally carved in stone or hammered out in gold and silver. Usually it would be either a wood or stone base that was then overlaid with gold and silver. And these decisions, artistic decisions, would then embody and manifest the power and presence of the deity. The image had to properly reflect the desired deity. Sometimes that meant giving the god an ideal body. This is why so many statues, particularly male statues, have the perfect body. Male gods are tall, muscular, with a nice V shape of their torso. Female goddesses tend to have slender waists, large busts, even war goddesses, let alone fertility goddesses. Next, the image had to reflect the desired attributes of the god that would be made manifest on the mortal plane. A god of writing, for example, would have a stylus or a scroll. A war god would have weapons. A fertility god would have, fertility things. These symbols of power helped imbue the new idol with the correct powers to accomplish the worshipper's goals. Images in the ancient world had real-world power and manifestation. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, once the statue was made, it needed to be purified and cleansed of all mortal touch and taint. This meant, and this will be a theme, a ritual. Different gods and cultures had different rituals, Although my personal favorite would be the mouth washing or mouth opening ritual from Mesopotamia. Once the purifying ritual is complete, the idol is dedicated to the god, and assumedly, the god then takes possession of the statue as his or her body. At which point, the statue is then properly installed in the god's house, i.e., temple. Temple being just, in most ancient languages, the same word for temple is the same as palace. It is now, with all of those steps done, that the statue is an idol, and the god is now made manifest in it. And if you're still confused, let me see if I can give you a modern analog that may or may not make sense depending on how you spend your time. One of my favorite hobbies, although I don't get to do this nearly enough, is playing video games. Now, as any gamer will tell you, the most difficult part of any game is character creation. This is the first thing you do, which is where you design your character that's going to be playing the game for you. Now, some games, of course, have preset characters that you can't change. But for any game that you can customize your character, this is the most difficult part, because this character is going to be you in the game. And so you choose the name, the hair color, the eye color, the gender, species, height, weight, build, so on and so forth. Sometimes I make a character look like me. Sometimes I make the character look nothing like me at all. Depends on what I'm going for. Regardless, this is often a very agonizing process that's very hard to get just right. Once you do it, your character's kind of set. Now this raises existential questions. Is this character, this avatar, me? Well, no, but also yes. Now, no, it's not me in the sense that the character physically is not me. I am not actually in the game. I am in my chair removed from it. My body or myself is sitting behind the screen in the real world, so to speak. And yet the character's essence, their actions, are me. Even the character's looks are a reflection of me. They may not be a physical reflection of me, but they are a reflection of a part of me that goes into creating this character. It is my mind, and it is my thoughts, of course, that guide the character's actions and decisions. In an MMO, or a massive multiplayer online game, when I am interacting with other player characters, I am interacting with real people through a virtual representation of themselves in their own avatars and characters. While their avatar is not actually physically them, and looks often nothing like them, they are still the avatar, they are still present in the avatar, as their avatar only does what they direct it to do. It's their thoughts, actions, and sometimes even voice behind the digital image that I'm interacting with. Idols worked a lot like that. They are not the god themselves, and no ancient person would ever think that the idol and the god are exactly the same thing. But the idols are the avatar through which the god works. This is why not every representation of a god was an idol. In a video game, especially MMOs, most characters are purely digital creations with no human being behind them. They're called NPCs, or non-player characters. Nor could any representation of a deity become an idol or become the manifestation of that god. Just like player characters in a video game, there had to be a mind or a person behind the image to give it life and power. This is the crucial point to keep in mind. According to their theology, the creation of an idol, or a temple for that matter, was not something anybody could just do on a whim. Kings, and it was almost always kings, had to be told by the gods to create even a statue, let alone a temple. For example, King Gudea of Lagash, a Sumerian city in the southeast of what is modern Iraq, had to be directed down to the dimensions, this should sound familiar to anyone who's read Exodus, to build a new temple for their patron god, Ningirsu. These directions, which Gudea followed to the letter, at least according to him, included not making a new idol for Ningirsu. Gudea wasn't explicitly ordered to do so, so he didn't make a new statue to go along with the new temple. Similarly, when the Assyrian king Esarhaddon decided to rebuild Babylon after his father Sennacherib had bulldozed the place, temples, statues, and temples and statues included, he had to go through a series of rituals, again, back to ritual, to get divine permission. He went even so far as to create a fictitious document that threw his father and grandfather under the bus in order to validate his project. The point is that despite Isaiah 44's wonderful parody of idolatry, one did not just make a statue out of leftover or make an idol rather, out of leftover firewood and start worshiping it. It was much more complicated. The creation of an idol for the indwelling of a god was a long, complicated process that had to be, in theory at least, divinely directed. So why go through all this trouble? Well, the main goal of all of this was to make the gods, and more importantly their powers, localized and accessible. In a world that was at the mercy of the elements, the localization of divine power was necessary for survival. To be clear, it is an oversimplification to reduce the ancient gods to merely personifications of nature. But the point is that people needed the power of the gods to survive. The patronage of the gods could potentially provide society with things like healthy offspring, both animal and human, bountiful harvest, victory in battle, and so on and so forth. Gods were power, and that power was channeled into the mortal realm through their idols and temples. So they made idols and temples to bring the gods down to earth, literally. This is what the Mesopotamian ziggurats, the kind of Babylonian version of a pyramid, was. Unlike a tomb for the pharaohs in Egypt, the Babylonian or Mesopotamian ziggurats were literal staircases for the gods to descend. This is, by the way, where the story of the Tower of Babel comes from, although the story in Genesis flips it on its head. Instead of the gods coming down to earth, it's humans going up to heaven. This localizing principle, however, had several important consequences for the nature of worship itself. First, by bringing the gods down to earth, it puts tremendous pressure on the people to provide for the gods. The gods were not stuck in these new bodies and homes. If they so chose, they could, of course, peace out at any time they wanted to. In a fantastic document known as the Lament of Ur, an anonymous poet describes the fall of the Ur-3 dynasty as being the result of the gods collectively abandoning the Sumerian cities, allowing them to be overrun by quote-unquote barbaric invaders. One goddess, in fact, stubbornly refuses to leave until she is dragged off by her fellow deities, kicking and screaming the whole time. The loss of the gods would have devastating consequences for the community. It was therefore paramount that they ensure that the gods were happy and well taken care of. This was a natural extension of ancient cosmologies that viewed human beings as nothing more than slave labor. We talked about this in the last episode. As a result, providing for the gods became the economic foundation for most societies. In Mesopotamia, again, for example, priests and temples actually preceded kings and palaces in the social development. Cities and urban centers were built around temples, not around palaces. In fact, as we'll see discuss in more detail in a moment, kings were merely seen as the earthly representative of the deities, acting as the governor for the gods and to organize labor for keeping the pantheon happy. Assyrian kings were notably not called kings for almost half a millennia of Assyria's existence. Instead, they took the title governor of Ashur, whose prime directive was to extend the realm of Ashur to the borders of the earth in order to make sure that his cult was properly and reverently maintained. The religions of Israel's day were essentially marketplaces, where the human worshippers bought divine favor and protection in the form of goods and services. One scholar has aptly labeled this system as the Great Symbiosis. While we don't have time to go into more detail, suffice it to say that ancient religions had this symbiosis down almost to a science, with detailed manuals listing prices for things like victory in battle, healthy pregnancy, insight into the future, so on and so forth. In short, this gave people control, or at least the illusion of control, over the divine and fundamentally uncontrollable universe that they found themselves living in. A second consequence was that in bringing the gods down to earth and localizing them in an idol, distance was placed between the people and the gods. By people, now I do mean you and me, normal everyday people. While in theory, gods could be accessed anywhere, and many did have public or semi-public shrines, in practice the gods could only be accessed through their authorized idols in their authorized temples, which were then, of course, controlled by kings, nobles, and priests. When we think of worship, we often think of coming to church on a Sabbath morning, singing songs, having a discussion, listening to a sermon, and so on. We probably also add in maybe personal devotion in the morning, like or small group Bible study, or maybe even community service like we do here at Northbrook. All good things and all good concepts of worship. However, this is not how the ancient world conceived of worship. In fact, our notions of worship would often be totally alien to them. With a handful of exceptions, the concept of cultivating a personal relationship with the gods, especially the big national gods, would simply not enter your mind. Instead, worship for them meant that the rituals and offerings that the gods asked for were properly carried out and maintained. This was generally the responsibility, of course, of the priests, who carried out the day-to-day cultic maintenance, and the kings, who again organized the labor to provide the priests with the material goods to keep the gods happy. As a result, the vast majority of the people had no direct or any access to the gods at all. Their access was hoping that the priests and kings did their job. Certainly one could go to the temple, but there was no guarantee that the priests would allow access to hear the positions. In creating temples and idols, and thus localizing the gods, the elites of ancient society were allowed to become the gatekeepers of who had access to the divine. They controlled worship and the favor of the gods, and the regular person had little or no choice but to go along with what felt like probably being a leaf in the wind. This created a fundamental societal division that was about power and control. Kings especially were viewed as being a different kind of human being. According to various myths regarding kingship, the institution was divinely appointed as part of a mortal reflection of the divine council, and kings were made the special agents of the god's will and power. They alone were made in the image of God, something that we'll come back to in a moment. Now, with rare exceptions, they alone could actually even look forward to a good afterlife or an afterlife at all. Everyone else was doomed to the wasteland that was the netherworld, and hope that your relatives had enough to give you food down to the netherworld. That's a different topic that's very complicated. A final consequence in localizing the presence and power of the gods actually made them vulnerable to the stealing of their power. Since the gods were localized in specific idols and not just any image, one could, and often did, steal someone else's god. You could then, and if you did so, you would deprive your enemy of their god's protection and potentially and likely often gain said protection and power for yourself. Indeed, god napping was a fairly regular occurrence. Importantly, once an idol was taken, it simply couldn't be replaced. The gods were essentially held prisoner by the power and authority of the other nation's gods. Sure, one could make another statue, but the god's presence would never be allowed to be manifest in that statue. Instead, it would remain a nice piece of lawn art, but nothing more. The power was limited to the idols the gods had chosen, and for the people to get that power back, they had to get the idol back. There are numerous examples of god napping, a lot of them from the Assyrians stealing Babylonian gods. Sennacherib famously either stole or outright destroyed the Babylonian cultic images, while Esarhaddon had to then restore. The process was so tedious that it was Esarhaddon's son, Shamash-shumi-ukin, who finished and officially restored Marduk's cult image to Babylon. Similarly, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal boasts of having recovered from Elamite cities, specifically the city of Susa, as its idol had been stolen over 1,400 years previously. From the Bible, there's of course the satirical story of the Ark of the Covenant journeying through Philistia, highlighting a biblical example of god napping, only this one turns the story on its head. Now I want to be clear, as much detail as this may have seemed, this is still a vast oversimplification of ancient religions. However, the bottom line is that idolatry is about forms of worship and religion, rather than the substantive content. That's more the first commandment. And as has been noted, character and morality matter very little in this divine economy. Everything is about exchange, control, and power. Idolatry is thus legalism in its final form. When it comes to the Yahwistic religion, it does seem very similar on the surface to its neighboring religions. Yahweh's presence is localized in the tabernacle and then later the temple, specifically at the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat, appearing to restrict his presence. Again, this is where the Shekinah glory was made manifest. There's a hereditary priestly caste that controlled access to the temple, and there's a great deal of ritual involved in keeping Yahweh happy. The blessing and curses of the Torah have a great symbiosis vibes. Follow the cult, good things happen. Fail, and bad things will happen. Yet, upon closer inspection, we find the opposite to be actually the practice. For all the tabernacle temple trappings, Yahweh was never actually localized there. The tabernacle, which was importantly mobile, was meant to be a convenient meeting point for the people, nothing more. That's why it's called the tent of meeting. Scripture also stresses that Yahweh, while Yahweh appreciated the thought, a temple, a permanent fixed structure, was actually not God's idea. It was David. Now, he approved of it, but it wasn't his idea, and he makes that point very clear. As useful as a temple could be, it is also interesting to note how Yahweh goes out of his way to meet people away from the temple. The book of Joshua and Judges has the angel of Yahweh, likely Christ himself, meeting people in random places like threshing floors, fields, and other out-of-the-way places. Elijah, for example, met Yahweh face to face on a mountain in the middle of the desert. Even when Yahweh does show up at the temple, it's pretty clear he's not localized there. As Solomon notes in his dedication prayer, Yahweh doesn't live in a human-made structure. Shortly after, in fact, Yahweh's presence overwhelms the entire temple complex, making it impossible for anyone to enter and offer the sacrifices. Similarly, when Yahweh calls Isaiah at the temple, Isaiah sees Yahweh above the temple, basically using the structure as his footstool. Any attempt to restrict Yahweh or localize his presence, like a neighboring idol, is very swiftly squashed. We've already referenced the story of the Israelites and the Philistines trying to control Yahweh through the possession of the ark, which went quite poorly for pretty much everybody involved. At the end of Judah's history, Jeremiah warns the leadership that Yahweh has zero problem letting his temple burn, none whatsoever, and so they shouldn't count on its presence to save them. Jesus would also make this point on multiple occasions, perhaps most explicitly in his conversation with the Samaritan woman, that God's worship is not restricted to a location, but is done in spirit. Just as Yahweh would not be confined to space, he would allow for no gatekeeping whatsoever. Yes, he did appoint the Aaronic priests and later Davidic kings, but it's important to note that these are concessions, not plans. In Exodus 19, the chapter preceding the commandments, Yahweh declares that all of Israel is to be a kingdom of priests who would reign upon the earth. This mixing of royal and language with priestly language suggests that in addition to the entire community, everybody being priests of Yahweh, they were also all to be kings as well. In fact, going back to Genesis 1 and 2, all of humanity is to be kings and priests. The image of God label placed on all human beings was in other societies limited only to kings, and on a couple very rare occasions, a priest or two. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden to tend it. Scholars have rightly noted that the Garden of Eden is envisioned as a temple. Kings and priests, all of us. While Yahweh did select Aaron's family for the priesthood and David's heirs to be for the kingship of Israel, he had no problem tossing either of them out when they became problematic. When Eli's sons started gatekeeping and becoming a barrier to the people of it to worship Yahweh, Yahweh condemned the family, removing them from priesthood. As David's heirs literally fell into idolatry, and when they used the temple as an excuse for oppression, he took away the first part of the kingdom from Solomon, and then the whole thing entirely went into exile with the Babylonians. As for Jesus' relationship with the priests, well, that's the closest we ever see the Son of God to completely and totally losing his temper. Nor do the rituals earn the blessings the way they did for other gods. As with the temple, his cultic instruments, his priests, his kings, Yahweh was more than happy to dispose of any of these things as soon as they became means of controlling him and barriers to worship of others. Saul found this out the hard way when he tried to use his spoils of war as a way of bribing Yahweh when he didn't follow God's orders to the letter. As Yahweh would point out in Psalms, sacrifices do not do anything for him. He doesn't need them. In fact, he says through Isaiah and Amos, he grows to hate these rituals, festivals, and songs that he had actually originally prescribed. While the Judahites faithfully fulfilled the technical prescriptions of the Torah, they utterly neglected the moral prescriptions of justice, mercy, and humility. Yahweh's blessings were never a reward for following the ritual parts of the law. It was always for being a people of justice, mercy, and humility. Indeed, when Micah asks, what are the requirements of Yahweh? That is the answer. Justice, mercy, and humility. What ultimately damned Israel and Judah was their adoption of an idolatry mindset, even if they never made an idol of Yahweh, of which there is no evidence one way or the other. They attempted to turn the religion of Yahweh prescribed into the means by which they control God and their neighbors. Instead of being loyal vassals to Yahweh, they tried to make him the vassal through his own religion. Instead of following his commands to serve their neighbor, the priests and kings used that same code to restrict people's access to God and to rob them blind. In the end, Yahweh removed Israel and Judah from his presence because they elevated the means of worshiping him over Yahweh himself. When we view the second commandment this way, how it applies to us today becomes apparent. As the first commandment dealt with who and what of worship, the second focuses on the how. We must never allow the means of worship to supersede the object of worship. That is legalism. It is frighteningly easy to fall into this trap. A story I heard one summer that I did literature evangelism, perhaps apocryphal, although I believe it to be true, was that one literature evangelist read somewhere in Ellen White that an angel attends every copy of the Great Controversy. After reading this person and fellow literature evangelist stuffed extra Great Controversy copies into their bags to begin each day to stock up on angels. I'm not making that up. This is the story I heard. Again, somebody else may have made it up, but this is the story I heard. Good intention as that might have been, that is a mentality of idolatry. Now, before you laugh at them the way I did, ask yourself this. Why do you have morning devotions? I am certainly all for having time with God to start your day, and I find it a most useful practice. It's one I do. But if you miss a morning devotion for one reason or the other, how do you feel? Do you feel naked, like God won't bless you or be with you because you didn't pray or read your Bible? There have been times in my life where I have approached devotion time like this. If I didn't read my Bible or pray or journal, I lived in fear that something bad would happen because God wouldn't be with me. I hadn't spent that time with him. To be perfectly honest, there are still days I have to combat this anxiety. This is an idolatrous mentality. This can apply to just about any religious practice. Why are you a vegetarian? How do you feel about it if we don't sing hymns in church? Or if we do? Do you panic if you forget to pay your tithe on time? Can you imagine not going to church on a Sabbath morning? If we are truly honest with ourselves, how often do we do these practices to experience the presence of God versus trying to manipulate God into doing nice things for us? Poisonous as it is, the prosperity gospel becomes a very tempting ideology. Follow God, do God things, and he will bless you. It's not about any of these things are bad. In fact, most of them I would argue, or all of them I would argue, are actually good in their proper place. And that's what makes idolatry so insidious. Just as the Israelites took the practices that Yahweh himself had instituted and twisted them into being a roadblock between themselves and God, we can very easily take the good things that God has given us to connect with him and make them the goal in and of themselves, rather than the means. In doing so, the means of worship become our idols. When these idols start cropping up, we very quickly take the next step into gatekeeping. Those who don't follow our worship prescriptions are now no longer allowed. To worship with us, to experience God, you have to dress like us, speak like us, eat like us, and worship like us. Now, there are, of course, a few universal no-nos. Child sacrifice, not okay. God cares very little for our means of worship. He cares about the heart of worship, or the spirit of worship, to borrow from Jesus. Where is the focus? What is the desire? The means take care of themselves. So who are we to demand that everyone else fall in line to the way we do things? Far from bringing people into an experience with Christ, we end up shutting the door in their face. And believe me when I say, we will be held accountable for that. As you can see, worship, the means by which we are to connect and interact with God, can become an idol that breaks both the first and second commandments. It breaks the greatest commandment by flipping our vassal relationship with God on its head. And it breaks the second commandment by making us a barrier to God and our neighbor. So, as we close this episode, I want you to think, where are your idols? We all have them. How are you trying to manipulate God? Where are you gatekeeping? And what will you do to remove them from your life?